Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the MoLab conversation about COVID, mobility, and well-being, with a specific focus about travel restrictions in today's discussion. So we have talked about whether or not a travel restriction is effective in general and what is the right condition in order to impose effective travel restrictions previously. Now I'm thinking of the future. Do you think there is a possible scenario in the future in which we do not need to impose travel restrictions such as lockdown or border closure? Rather, we securitize mobility, through tracing apps or through vaccine passport. I mean, I know it's very controversial, but through very sophisticated monitoring process. So on one hand, people are by and large free to move, but all the movement are monitored for medical and public health concerns. So I guess many countries have tried this way, right? So I wonder whether or not you can tell us, what kind of methods, measures that the government have adopted to securitize mobility instead of securitize borders. Here, securitize, I'm using quite a technical sense, does not mean that it is become a kind of existential security concern, but the securitize just means to make it safe, to avoid potential threat to public health and the public order. Yeah. Is it such a scenario possible, securitizing mobility instead of securitizing and closing borders? Tim, I see now you have unmuted yourself.
Oh, okay. Oh yes. Okay, yes, I'll try and say something. So what strikes me about that is that I can see where you're coming from, and I suppose a potential concern is that while those sorts of measures are, so the kind of close data collection and scrutiny that you're describing, I can see that makes sense from the public health point of view. But from my point of view, that seems to also, on the other hand, raise concerns as regards privacy and data protection, and at least something like within the EU framework, say that I think that balance of individual privacy rights versus the potentially quite invasive data collection procedures or those systems that would be required also across borders, potentially, if you're trying to monitor that internationally, would at least raise concerns in that regard.
And just to add to what Tim has said, but perhaps this is my slightly paranoid post-communist background, securitizing mobility has never been a good thing, meaning it's kind of on top of the privacy and data protection issues. There are also some other things that accompany the whole process, meaning issues that concern personal liberties and issues that also concern data use and the potential of misusing these personal data to feed into purposes that might underpin things that we don't want to underpin in our societies. So I think that on the one hand side, while it's important to introduce measures that would help to reduce the epidemiological effects of COVID-19 or any other future pandemic, we need to take into account personal liberties and not over-securitize mobility as such, but rather work on things that exist already and perhaps make the system function better rather than just kind of trying to control everything.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if I can add 2 more layers of complexity, which actually, I would say, come first, are less problematic than concerns about privacy and individual freedoms. Well, the first one is feasibility. We saw very clearly during the pandemic that some countries were simply unable to develop those systems quickly because you need well-developed technologies, and again, you need to think through the consequences and the people who are going to implement those technologies. So, countries that had experienced the SARS epidemic in 2003 were already better equipped to introduce those systems of tracking, of monitoring, of testing. Other countries were not. So that's a question of feasibility. The second question is the issue of discrimination. We see it very clearly with the idea of the travel pass. The travel pass, you need to have a vaccination, but of course, a lot of vulnerable individuals are left out of the vaccination programs, undocumented migrants, asylum seekers, refugees. Or you need to get a test, and a test in many countries can be extremely expensive. So that's just another form of recreated sort of a hierarchy of who can move and who cannot move. So I think there are those three levels of complexity: feasibility, problems of discrimination, and then of course concerns with privacy, human rights, and it's not something we can deal with very easily. This is not to say this shouldn't be used, but again, it's Pandora box.
So from the pedalist view is very clearly on the side of being rather the skeptical about the measure of securitizing mobilities. But here I wanted to offer a kind of empirical counterexample, but maybe it's due to my misunderstanding, which is so-called the East Asian model. And if you look at the most typical example is Taiwan. Hardly any lockdown. My relatives, friends there, they say, okay, life is quite normal. I mean, very high level of awareness, of course, in testing and the app and etc. But life goes on. Then Singapore, there's very nimble, very targeted, and there's like a Singapore style, almost a surgical type of isolation, but never total lockdown. Again, all the app and etc. And then South Korea, similar, lots of testing, monitoring, and China after Wuhan basically introduced all the apps and etc. I must say that by and large, people are happy with that type of regime. And then the argument is about the data use and privacy. The argument is that, we can handle, deal with that later on as a secondary concerns. So I don't know whether or not, based on your research, is this my understanding of East Asian model is probably a little oversimplified, or did you see any other part of the world which have adopted certain way of securitizing mobility still work, or you think it is just the danger is too grave to take that as a policy option now?
If I can just quickly, and then I'll hand over to Tim and Lorenzo. I honestly haven't looked at the East Asian model in very much detail, but from what I generally know, one thing is something that Lorenzo mentioned earlier on, and that's feasibility. Perhaps you may implement something in South Korea and Singapore, but if I tell you implement the same thing in Cameroon or Sierra Leone, or even in country in one of the Pacific islands that Tim loves very much, that would be a completely different thing, because those kinds of measures need resources, and they also need different types of also technologies, etc., etc. So that's one of the things. The second thing I would say are societal preferences, and I think we could see that in different corners of the world, people responded in different ways to measures, from societies where rules and mobility restrictions were fully respected to some, including my own country, where people just violated all the measures. So I guess it also has to do with societal norms and the ways in which different societies adapt. So I would still, even if the people of different South Asian and East Asian countries are in a way happy with what securitization of mobilities has in a way brought back to their lives, that's great. But I would be very cautious about arguing that the same effects would be achieved in the rest of the world.
Yeah, if I may, a quick point on the sort of feasibility thing in different countries, just as a as another example, I suppose, as people may know, the UK poured millions into trying to develop some sort of contact tracing system that completely failed. So it's also, that's a country that would like to consider itself technologically, world leading, whatever, and very clearly wasn't. So I guess that can happen anywhere, I suppose. And just a quick thought. This is slightly off to one side of what you were saying, I think, but in terms of practices from East Asia that might be more generalizable, this is a little bit anecdotal, but as far as I remember, in I think Vietnam and Singapore and maybe others, measured early on, that was used early on, was quarantine, in the sense of forcing travelers to stay in a hotel facility at their own expense. So where the expense then is a kind of added disincentive, I suppose, for people to travel at all. And I think that is quite different to the approach, say, in Europe, where it tended to be that self-isolation was required, so that people would arrive in the country and go to their own home or to somewhere, staying in a hotel, their own hotel, or at someone's house or whatever. And then the enforcement of that is much more difficult. And I think there's now a bit of a move towards something more like what Vietnam and other countries had in place, of having people actually go and stay in a hotel, so they really are isolated from the rest of the population and not traveling within the country upon arrival and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's a very important debate to have, and it's going to take time for countries in Europe, in Africa, in the Americas, to build up tracking systems. For sure, that is the direction. But if we think of research, one very interesting empirical question that was raised by Tim is, why is it that any attempt to build those tracking systems during the pandemic failed so miserably? Tim mentioned the UK, but the same in Italy and in France and probably many other countries. And the answer, I think, was suggested by Jelena when she was referring to different ideas of trust in the other citizens and also in your institutions. That certainly something that plays a big role into this.
That is great. Yeah, I think it is, of course, a very empirical question. Why is it worked in some places and it doesn't work in others? This empirical question is immediately related to normative questions, right? I mean, the thing that works is not because of technology, but also because of people's perception about it. And then I think it's also raised quite important philosophical questions, which I suppose all migration scholars should consider at a certain stage, especially after COVID. The question is about what is individual as an analytical and legal, as well as, of course, political category. In this pandemic, when public health really become a public issue, so the boundary, we talk about the boundary of society, but the boundary between individuals are really blurred. The virus just can penetrate very easily into your body. I think the classical thinking is that we treat individual as, of course, autonomous entity. In a way, treat the individual as a black box in a very classical legal thinking. What inside of the individual we normally don't interfere. we treat the individual as it is manifested as a whole entity. But I'm just wondering whether maybe in East Asia, the perception of individual is slightly different. Maybe they are most postmodern. They don't think individual is a one autonomous entity. So individual can be taken apart. So the question of liberty and the question of equality is not measured by one individual against other individuals, but probably measured by something else. I don't know what the language can describe that. But I think it is really fascinating. It is fascinating precisely because it's now we see it's not a pure metaphysical theoretical question, but it is immediately a material question, a policy question, and a technological question. They all come together. So that I think probably is one of the, at least for me, the most fascinating things that I became aware of during the pandemic.